Let's start by recapping the last episode. We talked about why autistic people are less likely to be Christian
Yeah.
and gave the broad high level overview of it. And we promised that in the next episodes we'd get a lot more into the specific details about it. And so that's what we're going to do in this episode. Specifically, this is part one of two, talking about doctrine. So in the last episode, I gave three primary reasons three primary drivers of cognitive dissonance in autistic people. The primary one being doctrine and ideology, the next one being the experience of church, and then the final one being issues of hostility and lack of accommodation. So
Yeah.
let's start getting into doctrine and ideology. I've been working on how to present this episode for 2 years, and I've redone my plan for this episode like 6 times. It is very hard to discuss in a neutral way without ruffling feathers, and I don't think it's possible because
Yeah.
doctrine and ideology is particularly important to Christianity. No matter what branch of Christianity you belong to, um, Christianity is a religion in which your doctrine and your ideology really matter.
Yeah.
Um, People get very defensive over doctrine. It's understandable. I get it. Um, a lot of people interpret critique of certain doctrines or certain doctrinal stances as like a personal attack. I can assure you it's not. Um, and I want to try to discuss the issues without getting bogged down into the issues themselves. I don't want to actually engage in the debate about these contentious issues, more just say these are the issues that exist. Often within Christianity, there's a very like my way or the highway attitude where it's like you either believe exactly what I do or you're a heretic, and I'm not going to wade into those debates. I'm not really going to entertain that type of attitude. I don't think it's useful or productive. If I say something in this episode and you disagree with it, you can find me on Twitter or on Discord or something like that, or you can email me and we can have that discussion. But there's no way I can keep this episode series to under 40 hours and go with and like properly go into doctrinal issues in this for the sake of brevity. I'm just not going to do that. Another more disclaimers. Autistic people are a varied multitude. There is no monolithic autistic person. There is no monolithic autistic ideal or one set of things that we conform to. When I talk about this, I'm talking in general and about generalities. There are many autistic people for whom doctrine does not play any role in creating cognitive dissonance. However, that being said, doctrine is often the primary reason cited for autistic people for leaving the church. It is, however, not the only reason. Doctrine and ideology alone is not why autistic people leave. It is often cited, though, as the primary driver. Inevitably, in this episode, we will discuss certain theological issues or stances, and I understand that there are various apologists out there who have various responses to these answers. I know what these apologists have to say. Pretty much everyone I interviewed also knows what they have to say because one
Oh,
of the
yeah.
through lines of autism, and especially when autism interacts with Christianity, is that we do intensive research. It is likely I know what these people have to say about it. It's been my special interest since I was like 19. There are good and reasonable, legitimate concerns with these answers. And reasonable, intelligent people who analyze them can accept them and they can also reject them. I understand. I may bring something up and you may think that's not an issue because X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And just understand there is more than just a specific apologist's answers to these particular doctrinal concerns. If you find their answers convincing, that's great. But the majority of people that I talk to and the majority of people I've surveyed do not find them convincing, which is why we're going to talk about them. Most of the data I use from this is formed from conclusions taken from ex Christians and non Christian autistics, because as we discussed last episode, they are usually the best at identifying pain points because they have real and active experience with those pain points. Also, data is drawn from practicing autistic Christians who are really struggling with their faith. I understand this episode will feel negative to some practicing Christians, and I just don't know how to avoid it while actually honestly addressing this topic with the seriousness it deserves. With those things cited, let's get into it. With all the disclaimers read, let's start the episode. Just as the first point, I mentioned at the beginning of the episode that this is cited as a primary reason for autistic people leaving the church. However, I have noticed that there is a gender discrepancy in this. It is cited as a top reason for 80% of men and the top reason for 65% of women. The only group that I've noticed where doctrine and ideology isn't the most cited is for queer autistics. Usually, the main reason for queer autistics for leaving the church is overt hostility. Now, do you maybe, Amy, want to try to take a guess at why there is a 15% discrepancy between autistic men and autistic women for citing doctrine as the top reason for leaving the church?
I would say part of it has to do with the different ways that autistic men and autistic women present in terms of autistic traits that we've discussed in earlier episodes, as well as the way that men and women generally are socialized. I think I'm not surprised by that because a lot of the times the men will that I've encountered will often start off by looking into the doctrine as they get older. They don't particularly have as common a negative experience as women and other marginalized groups within Christianity because unfortunately, especially in more conservative churches, they often are the top of a hierarchy. They might experience things like bullying and the like in their formative years there, and just a general difficulty with social connection. But in terms of unequal treatment on the basis of their gender, they don't often experience that. So that's not something that they'll often be catalyzing for them. Again, this is generalities, and I'm fully aware of the fact that there are many men, particularly men who are not straight or cisgender, do in fact experience some pretty horrendous marginalization, as well as men of color in predominantly Western white areas in churches. The thing is, with a lot of autistic women who examine doctrine, there's usually a catalyst to do, and very often it's receiving unequal treatment due to, again, difficulties with social connection being autistic. But on top of that, it's issues of our treatment due to our gender. And we touched on it previously about, for example, the denial of women's ordination when pastoral leadership is seen as the pinnacle top of a kind of hierarchical structure, when a lot of us who are in the autistic community adopt a more egalitarian view of things. I I know that for myself personally, when I was deconstructing and reconstructing my Christianity, doctrine featured last in all of that in sequential order. Not in terms of importance, because that did become quite important to me, but in terms of what I examined within myself and my place within the Christian community and what I believed. It was started off with the catalyst of experience of mistreatment and spiritual abuse, then looking around me and seeing actions that did not quite line up with doctrine, which then pointed to points of doctrine that I'd previously taken for granted, that I, upon closer examination, realized I wasn't quite sure if I completely upheld and really needed to explore further. So while again these are generalities, and of course these do differ depending on if you're a queer person or a person of color as an intersecting sort of identity, it can very much be a common thread throughout a lot of these accounts.
Yeah, no, you hit the nail right on the head there. You got, like you said, the reason for that discrepancy, as I found, the socialization aspect of it is definitely part of it, but I think the biggest driving reason is more so that women typically have to put up with a lot more things that cause cognitive dissonance than men do, and they have a lot more opportunities to encounter inciting events that will cause cognitive dissonance than men. That being said, it's only 65% cited as the top reason. As you've said, exactly, women will usually something else will trigger them to start looking into doctrine, and then they'll look into doctrine and they will often encounter the same types of issues that men do as well. Yeah, that's the reason for the gender discrepancy. You 100% got all my points there. So yeah, getting into it, you find doctrine and ideology throughout the entire pipeline that I talked about last episode, where evangelism, catechism, and maintenance, ideology and doctrine feature very heavily in all three of those different phases. And then one really important phenomenon that I think is really important to talk about, to understand doctrine and ideology and why it features so prominently in autistic deconversion, is what I call the hammer nail phenomena. I don't know if it's a saying in Australia, but there's a saying we frequently use. It's when all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail.
Oh
Um,
yeah,
and
yeah, I'm familiar with that
yeah,
phrase.
and so I think that is a really big part of why ideology and doctrine feature so heavily within the autistic struggle with Christianity, and why it's such a driver of cognitive dissonance. One thing we'll talk about probably in much later episodes is the primary mode of engagement for autistic people with Christianity is through intellectual analysis. So the place where autistic people find themselves most naturally engaging is the intellectual side of things. And I think this is often because the intellectual side of Christianity is the only side of Christianity that autistic people can immediately relate to. A lot of the more relational, emotional, social, and sensory aspects of Christianity are done in such a way that is often very inaccessible and unrelatable to autistic people. However, the intellectual components of Christianity, like apologetics, theology, all those types of things, are immediately accessible to autistic people, and we derive immense satisfaction from that. And so often, the faith journey of an autistic person heavily revolves around doctrine and ideology. And there's this sort of like self-licking ice cream cone effect where
Yeah,
like you are really intellectually engaged in Christianity, so you focus on doctrine and ideology, which really intellectually engages you, which makes you more focused on it, and it's like the primary driving factor around which a lot of autistic people focus their faith. And so I think that's one of the reasons that you'll get this phenomenon. Like a lot of autistic people, I've heard the phrase far more than once, will describe themselves as religious, not spiritual, because instead of the spiritual, not religious, because they see themselves in engaging with Christianity and they consider themselves Christians, but they just find all these other aspects of Christianity very difficult to access and very difficult to engage with.
yeah,
Another factor is why autistic people are so drawn to it is because there are clear right and wrong answers. Like in a lot of places in the church, like the experience of the Holy Spirit, it's very subjective, it's very difficult to assess. You're not quite sure what's going on. But with doctrine and ideology, it's no, this is what the council's decided. If you don't agree with it, you're wrong. And that's not every claim. There's obviously like shades and gradients of right and wrong and stuff like that. But
yeah,
a lot of the way that Christian doctrine and ideology is often taught appeals to that autistic desire for clean, discrete answers that can be understood with that kind of black and white thinking mentality a lot of us have. And then the other one is doctrine and ideology often make testable and historical claims, and autistic people tend to be drawn to those things because
Yeah.
I just find in general the things that we can see, touch, and measure just seem more real to us and more meaningful to us, and we tend to gravitate to that. And so
Yeah.
it all these factors like come together to create this hammer nail phenomenon where we have the hammer of ideology, and that's the only thing that we go through in the Christian faith. And I think that's why it's such a major factor in a lot of autistic deconversion. Again, not the only factor, but yeah.
Yeah.
So there's this book. It's called Autistic Thinking and the Life of the Church by a guy named Stuart Rapley. He wrote it based on interviews with autistic Christians. He had a sample set of, I think, 9. Don't quote me on that, though. I can't remember off the top of my head. And what he did in his book is he looked at views of concepts of God, the Bible, prayer, and then supporting texts. So holy texts that aren't the Bible, so like in the Anglican Church, the Book of Common Prayer or something like that, or in if you're Lutheran, like the Book of Concord and the Large Catechism and stuff like that. And basically, what he found is that autistic people have a really strong bias towards systematizing whenever they think about all of these topics, which means they tended to have non anthropomorphic understandings of God, which means they are less likely to attribute human features to God. They think of the Bible as having value in historic context rather than personal interpretation. They tend to think of prayer as being meditation and contemplative rather than relational. And they typically saw supporting texts of the church as truth reinforcement rather than community reinforcement. So he has this chart in the book, and it's quite interesting. And I'll try to describe it, and I'll probably link it in a picture of it in the show notes. But basically, there's a kind of left of graph and right of graph. On the left of graph is systematic emphasis. On the right of the graph is relational emphasis. And he has mapped out where he placed the participants in his research and generally where churches stand and then where most congregations stand. And he has this mapped out, and the graph itself is funny because all the autistic participants are heavily on the or the systematic emphasis on topics of the concept of God, the Bible, prayer, and supporting texts, whereas the vast majority of the congregation is on the complete opposite side. And yeah, this is a really helpful visualization tool, and it tells you a lot of information right off the start. I think there is a little bit of a potential false dichotomy in here where I don't like systemic emphasis and relational emphasis. I don't think are actually polar opposites. And he talks about this in the book, but just to nuance this a little bit, there is that potential. But yeah, overall, I found like with my research, it's yeah, that's pretty much exactly what I found as well. And it's important to understand this because if you think about where doctrine and ideology are the most influential in the views of all these things, it's all on the systematic side, right?
Yeah.
Doctrine and ideology is about the systematic understanding of things. And autistic people, with respect to these 4 different pillars of understanding Christianity, are all on the systemic side of or systematic side of things. One of the most important things to talk about is like how do autistic people understand the claims of Christianity, because Christianity makes a lot of claims about the world and the reasons that things happen in the world, the way things happen. And I think it's important to look at autistic people who aren't in the faith and just look at how they look at these claims versus autistic people who are already in the faith. And I think it makes the most sense to just start out by talking about autistics outside the faith
Yeah.
and basically talking about how their understandings of things may fundamentally affect place barriers to their actual entry into the church. And so I want to start talking about the battle between science and religion, because this is a very frequent talking point that you see a lot, especially from non Christian autistics. When you ask them, have you thought about Christianity? They'll be like, no, I'm more into science. Um, and like a lot of times you'd be like, that's actually a false dichotomy. Science and religion aren't necessarily opposed. But the predominant view that I found from autistic people who aren't religious is that science and religion are in tension with each other. Like there is a battle between science and religion, and you can
Yeah.
either have science or you can have religion, and you can't have both. And so when you're talking to a lot of autistics who aren't in the faith, this often poses a huge barrier to whether or not they actually get into the faith. We talked about it before, but a lot of autistic people were really into new atheism and the new atheist movement, because the new
Yeah.
atheist movement, when you look at the way that new atheists analyze the world, that's the frame they looked through. They said this science is right, and science and religion are trying to do the same thing. It's just that science does it in a better, more reliable way. So everyone, ditch religion. It's not helping you. Join the science club.
It was a very systematized way of looking at atheism as well. I think previous iterations of atheism hadn't been so publicly systematized. And I previously just touched on this, how when I examined atheism as it existed then, which was predominantly the new atheist movement, it it was almost a mirror image of the more fundamentalist understandings of Christian doctrine, just taking a negative view. And at the time, I personally found it too simplistic. But I can understand why a lot of people, especially young autistic men, really got into it, because yeah, that systematization you talk about with faith, it very much applied for in the new atheist movement for atheism.
Yes. And I think, yeah, exactly what you said. I think new atheism was just like perfectly designed for young autistic men, with all of the, especially the problematic aspects also, were like,
Oh
yeah,
goodness,
this is
yes.
something reproduced a lot unintentionally or intentionally by young autistic men, where it's, look, there are right answers and there are wrong answers, and we have the right answers and we can prove it to you, and you have the wrong answers. And yeah, there, I think of some of the people like Richard Dawkins analyzing religion, and I look back at it, and even when I was like in the new atheist community, I look at what Dawkins was doing, and I was like, I don't think he particularly has the most coherent understanding of Christianity.
Oh,
But yeah, the other thing, a lot of Christians reject this idea that there's an actual battle between science and religion. However, there are a lot of Christians who are like, yeah, there is a battle between science and religion is right. A lot of autistic people are who are raised in those communities find that view of religion to be perfectly acceptable. However, to autistic people outside of those communities, it's a complete non-starter. I think of things like young Earth creationism, where if you're a young Earth creationist and you talk to a typical autistic person who is not a Christian, it's just a complete non-starter, because they
yeah.
will usually have this default view that science and religion are in conflict, and science is just a better, more accurate version of doing the same thing. However, in contrast to this paradigm of science and religion being in conflict with each other, there's also this other view, which is called NOMA, or non overlapping magisteria. NOMA was this idea that was put forward by Stephen Jay Gould in his book, I believe it's called The Rock of Ages. And basically, what he was trying to do was he was trying to solve the conflict between science and religion, to say, look, science is trying to answer one set of questions, and religion is trying to answer a completely different set of questions. And the
Oh,
truths that religion is trying to answer are not truths that are accessible to science. And to a lot of people, this is a really satisfying way of resolving the perceived tensions between science and religion. However, what it often does for autistic people is it basically says science deals with the truths that you care about, and religion deals with the truths that you don't care about
Oh,
in different magisteria, right? So noma
right.
means, yeah, non-overlapping magisteria, as though the truths of religion and the truths of the material world are do not overlap. And a lot of autistic people really don't care about the truths of religion in the Noma model. What they care about is what are the mechanics of the thing? How does this work? Why does this thing do the thing that it's supposed to do? And like all of those claims are ones that are in this model under the realm of science. And so even if an autistic person who isn't in the faith doesn't accept this idea of the battle between science and religion and instead accepts this kind of Noma paradigm, it still is a massive barrier to entering religion because they'll look at it and they'll just go like, I don't really have a use for this. It's a thing for the this sounds like a thing for the neurotypicals. This is not something I care about, which is something I've heard before. It's I actually really only care about the truths in the domain of science. And while I think religion has lots of good things to offer other people, I don't really see much use for it. And I talked to a woman named Joanna Leidenhag. She is a philosopher, and she's done a lot of interesting work with autism and theology. And a lot of the things she works on have to do with theology and neuroscience. And when I was talking to her, I asked her about Noma and the battle between science and religion. And yeah, here she is.
Yeah, I'm not actually a fan of Noma. I know lots of people that are, but I'm really not. Because I think it gets back to that first thing I said, that it presumes that there are these very clear categories. And I think the history of science and religion and contemporary sciences and religious beliefs overlap. They're messy. You can't really tell where one begins and one ends. And so I don't think it's historically accurate to suggest that there are two domains. I also think it starting off with something like Noma, or sometimes called the independence view, that these two things are independent of each other, also really sets up the possibility of conflict because it sets up two things that are separate. They can go to war with one another or they can be friends with one another, but there are two things. And I don't think there are two things. I think there are 2,000 things. I think there are lots of scientific theories and methods, lots of religious doctrines and beliefs and practices. And we need to get specific if we're going to see how they interact. So I'm not really a fan of Noma for that reason. And also Gould, who is the scientist, evolutionary biologist who came up with the phrase Noma and is quite famous for it, I don't think he really thought it meant that either. So I think we've told stories about it that have made it more independence than it really was. Gould, if you read his original article, just says, "Oh, there are different tools for investigating the world," but that's a much more deflated claim than is normally seen to be represented by Noma.
Yeah, and so I mean, I agree with Joanna. I think her analysis is right, but not only do I agree with her analysis is right, but I know that her analysis of Noma is actually really important when you're trying to talk to autistic Christians who or autistic people who aren't Christians, who are outside of Christianity and interested in Christianity. Usually one of the first things that I do when I talk to them is I have to explain exactly what Joanna just explained, that the relationship between science and religion is not a clear cut, there's one and then the other. There's a long, messy historical intertwining of both of these things. And religion isn't trying to replace science, and science isn't trying to replace religion. However, I think it's important to bring up because the popular perception, at least from autistic people, is that Christian doctrine is basically trying to do what science is trying to do, but just very badly. Again, the reason this matters and the reason we're even taking this diversion to talk about this is, or like the independence theory and the battle between science and religion are mostly the two dominant worldviews that you'll find held by autistics outside of the faith. And neither of these different views lead to a understanding of Christianity that most autistic people can actually reckon with in a meaningful way. And really, again, from my own personal experience, I think the only way to convince autistic people to give Christianity a shot is to go through a really painstaking process of redefining the entire framing of the conversation and going through talking through epistemology and like how we know things and how and what we can know and what we can't know and all these types of things. But yeah, I'm bringing this up just because it factors so heavily into the debate between science and religion. And I think we'll play another clip here for Joanna talking about that exact type of thing.
So I think the conflict is largely a myth, but that's not because science and religion never disagree with one another. It's because science isn't really one thing, and neither is religion. There are lots of sciences, they have different methods, they study different things, and sometimes they conflict with one another. But that's not a problem, right? That's just disagreement to make progress, to find new discoveries. We clump them all together and call them science, but it's a fairly flexible and not static category, right? There's not this one thing called science that's always existed. And the same with religion, right? It depends on which religion, which expression of a particular religion. Liberal and evangelical Christianities are quite different, particularly on the issue of how they relate to some of the specific natural sciences. So when we ask questions like, how does science and religion relate? We've already started off on the wrong foot because it forces us to imagine that there's this one thing called science and this one thing called religion, and they're either in conflict or they're, as you say, non-overlapping magisteria. They just exist independent of each other, or maybe they're in harmony. I think that's all wrong because I don't think there's any one thing called science and any one thing called religion. And I think the history of science in particular, as well as the history of the church, is really helpful in deconstructing the problem in the question itself. How do science and religion relate?
So yeah, this is again a really important topic to talk about with respect to doctrine and ideology because when you look at doctrinal and ideological conflicts that autistic people have with Christianity, the biggest one that is usually cited is that science is it's a conflict between science and religion. I talked about last time or last episode my struggle with accepting evolution. And I should say, accepting evolution as true didn't lead me to leave Christianity. I stayed within Christianity even after I accepted that evolution was true. But it was a major factor that made me have to reevaluate a significant chunk of my faith at the time. And it led me to doing a whole lot more questioning of other sorts of doctrines that I had been taught. And when I talk to a lot of ex Christians, a lot of them will say, I was raised as a young earth creationist, and then I went to college and I learned that evolution was probably true. And if evolution was probably true, then everything I had been taught was probably false. So I started researching it, and that led to a series of events which led to deconversion. And like a story very similar to mine. It's important to understand that. And another thing that's like really important to understand when we're talking about like doctrine and ideology and how these things work together and how they lead to cognitive dissonance in autistic people is to just understand a typical autistic worldview and the typical autistic experience of the world. And a lot of, if you're autistic and listening to this will not be news to you, but for a lot of people, they don't realize that autistic people experience and process the world around them in a way that's often very different from most non autistic people. Our brains just work differently. And this has been shown in like fairly robust ways with fMRI imaging and things like that. We'll do things we'll do a lot of things. So like we will over process information that non-autistic people will under process. We'll under process information that non-autistics will over process. We'll miss a lot of nonverbal communication and will rely very heavily on other forms of communication for information transfer. And often, because we miss nonverbal communication, will try to make up for it in different ways and will try to overcompensate or undercompensate, or will develop entire analytical mechanisms for trying to understand how to interpret nonverbal communications. I don't pick up on nonverbal communication very well. I find it very difficult to track. And so I trained myself to recognize human emotions by basically having a catalog of human emotions that I've recognized and like picturing people in those moods and then looking at a person and seeing them and then going through like flipping through a database of other people that I've seen in those moods that when I know their mood, and then I like try to line the two up in my head and I go, okay, this person looks like this other person did when I know they were in that mood. So they are probably in this mood. And like that's my method for figuring out nonverbal communication. And so these types of things fundamentally shape our world and our responses to it. And it shapes the way we think and it shapes the way that we analyze the world. And there's no one shared autistic world experience, but we all have like clusters of these types of experiences. And I'm mentioning all this because I think what this leads to, and what I've seen in a lot of autistic people, is this leads to a sort of intuitive skepticism, an intuitive empiricism. And empiricism, I mean like empirical analysis. So, like, you know something by testing it, by looking at the results of those tests, and a kind of very data driven approach to understanding the world. There's a real need for a lot of us to like measure, sense, touch, test, and verify in order to know something. And a lot of us like don't do very well with uncertainty, myself included. Like it's it took me a very long time to train myself to cope with having to live with uncertainty. And I didn't get to do that until I was like in my 20s and was forced to. But yeah, this leads to autistic people overall having generally skeptical, empiricist, kind of scientific modes of analysis of the world. And again, this isn't every autistic person, but this has been verified in quite a few different studies. And
I
I
could
don't
actually
have them
share.
here,
Yeah,
but yeah.
sorry.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could actually share, yeah. Someone who was not very, had some interest in science, but was not the most scientifically motivated in terms of examining the world around me and never engaged much with the whole conflict between science and religion thing. It's interesting the ways you talk about like how we interact with the world, how we still, even those like myself who are a bit more humanities minded, still was through a very systematized lens. You were talking about how you like got to detecting other people's emotions. For me, I could detect very obvious emotions. If someone was crying, they were sad. If someone had wrinkles in their forehead and were had a higher pitch of voice, they were cranky or angry. If someone was laughing, they were happy. Like those were obvious to me. But when it came to, and this is again, this is quite common with how a lot of girls on the spectrum will try and compensate for it. I would observe group dynamics around me, and very often I was known to hang around the edges of a room or a playground before I would join in with a group of people. And usually I had to be prompted to do so. That was because I was trying to understand what the dynamics were before I entered a space. And it was my way of training myself to know what I needed to mimic. A lot of girls on the spectrum use mimicry to mask our traits. I also used to gaze in my face a lot in mirrors, and my parents thought it. I think they must have thought I was going to be some vapid, vain, like teenager, but thankfully I wasn't. It was more that I was trying to ensure that I had appropriate facial expressions because I wasn't always good at doing that. And another thing that would go towards helping me learn about more subtle nonverbal cues. My mother and I would watch movies because even though I didn't have a diagnosis until adulthood, my family and I knew that I didn't interact socially like neurotypical people do. They knew from an early age that I was not very good at detecting more subtle forms of body language. And my mum would use movies to make me learn on the fly how such body language works. And where more ambiguous motives might be in a situation, because again, I tended to take things at face value. And I think as well, yeah, so even when dealing with more of abstract interests that I had in other human beings and more social views of the world versus purely scientism views of the world, I was still using a very systematized way of trying to learn how to navigate all of that. And I think that does speak to a lot of autistic people, particularly autistic women, who try to navigate the world through a more social lens.
Yeah, and so I think what you just described there is actually like a scientific approach to understanding human behavior, right? Because what you're observing, you make a hypothesis, you go out and you test that hypothesis, you come
Yes.
back and you assess how well did that hypothesis work. And like that really is, it's just a primitive form of science, right? It's just you might not be conscious that this is the process that you're going through. But I have that exact experience. I had it when I was about 12. So it took me until I was about age 12 to I always knew I was a little bit weird and I always knew that there was something different from me, but it took me to age 12 when I realized, oh, there is something profoundly different about me. There is something like I'm on a completely different program than the rest of these people, and I need to figure it out. And I did exactly what you said, except I was very conscious that I was doing it. And so I would intentionally watch people figure
Yeah.
out what they would do. One of the things, I have an older brother who is not autistic and very socially functional. Like he was always the most popular kid in his grade, always very well liked and everything like that. And I would just sit there and watch him and figure out what he would do. And I didn't know what he was doing right or wrong, and I couldn't figure out what the through line was, but I
Yeah.
did figure out if I just mimicked him and I just pretended to be him, somehow things would work. I didn't understand why, but even in this sense, a lot of the way that you do that, it does develop this, it's the hammer nail effect, right? Like
Yes,
you
it
you
is.
take this very systematized approach to doing things, you do that thing and then it works, and then that's the thing that works, because when you trust your own feelings and your own intuitions on how you should do things, it often fails and blows up in your face. But when I follow this like intentional systematic approach of watching, analyzing, testing, verifying, watching, analyzing, testing, verifying, and then looping over and over until I get to a situation in which things are working and things are flowing smoothly. This I think this is key to understanding the cognitive dissonance caused by a lot of Christian doctrine and ideology in autistic people, because this is often our base programming, and it is not how Christian doctrine is not meant, or messaged, maybe is the better way to put it. It's not
Yeah.
messaged assuming that you think like that and that this is your primary way of understanding the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, like this becomes a really large potential problem in a few key areas. So, one of the key areas is when Christianity makes non empirical claims or claims that can't be proven that are really central and important. A lot of Christian dogmas just need to be taken on faith. Now, there are some people out there who do not think that is the case. There are some people who think like all the central claims of Christianity can be proven through historical analysis. I don't think that's the case. I know there is
No.
an apologetics industry that tries to make it seem like that's the case. I just I don't think that's possible.
No. It can only
And
go so far.
yeah, and I just think that the types of evidence we have available, what that data can tell us, how it can tell us it, is not enough to prove a lot of the claims that are made by Christianity, despite what many apologists will try to tell you.
Yes.
And like a lot of A lot of young autistic people, like autistic teenagers, however, will be really drawn to these apologists that say, this is how we know that we can prove that Christianity is true. And so, if you talk
Yeah.
to a lot of autistic teenagers, they love apologetics. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
having talked to many of them and having talked to many people who used to be autistic teenagers, it's always like, I loved apologetics. Apologetics was the best
Yeah.
because it takes all these natural ways that we see the world, and it takes that and it applies it to Christianity, and it says this is a good and proper way to analyze the Christian faith. And I think that causes some problems. Actually, I don't just think that causes some problems.
Yeah.
I know it causes some problems
Yes.
because eventually autistic teenagers stop being autistic teenagers and become autistic adults, and they enter into a world of complexity and nuance that they aren't often ready for.
Hi.
Basically, what happens is autistic people have this natural way of thinking about the world, and then they are presented, and then they apply that to Christianity. And a lot of times they will read doctrine through the lens of this kind of skeptical, investigative, systematic analysis process, and they'll investigate doctrine and it will come up wanting, right? One of the things that I've found for an interesting case is reconverts. So people who used to be Christian left Christianity for a while and have now
Mm.
come back to Christianity.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
one of the things that I've noticed in all of them is they have all completely changed their like ontological approach to doctrine. So the way that they now think of doctrine is completely different, like at a fundamental level. Like I have never seen a
Mm.
person leave Christianity because of doctrine and then come back and maintain that same understanding. A significant number of reconverts would hold to a postmodern ontology. A lot of autistic people who end up coming back to the faith come back to the faith in a postmodern way. And I know a lot of people are already going, "Oh no, postmodernism. It's not as scary as you think." But I see that a lot because basically the a lot of them recognize that the tools and approaches for analyzing doctrine that they were used to using and that they were taught to use simply do not allow them to accept the doctrine that they were taught, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so why does why does doctrine cause autistic people to leave? Let's maybe go into that a little more. We talked about how doctrine will often block autistic people from joining the church, but let's maybe go into more examples of why they actually leave. So, again, cognitive dissonance is the major driving factor. And cognitive dissonance is when you have two competing ideas of, or two competing conceptions of reality that cannot both be simultaneously true, and it causes you discomfort. And we talked about autistic people have lower thresholds, we experience it more intensely, and we have more opportunities to for this. And I'm going to talk about how all those things apply to understanding of doctrine. Let's talk about some cognitive biases that autistic people have. The first one that's relevant to this is rigidity. So, autistic people often are pretty rigid in their thinking. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. They're a lot of times we're not great at nuance, and we often have to teach ourselves how to understand nuance,
Yeah.
and it usually comes like embarrassingly late in our life. It is the reality. A lot of us are very rigid thinkers, and there's this sort of all or nothing, in or out, like either something is 100% true or it's 0% true. And when something is either 100% true or 0% true, most of the time you're going to be on the 0% true. Just because if something's 99% true, it's since it's not 100, we're back at 0. Autistic people are also like really conceptually sensitive, which means they pay a lot of attention to very specific details about what's going on. They care a lot about how all of the interlocking pieces work and how everything meshes together, and they have a real hyper attention to details. And a real hyper attention to details is often seen as a good thing But like when it comes to doctrine, sometimes if you analyze things, I forget the phrase, but there's a theologian who talks about how historical analysis of the Bible is like dissecting a frog. In that when you
Mm.
start to, you can dissect the frog and you can understand the frog in a level of intense detail, you will also kill the frog. And
Yeah.
autistic people and their hyper attention to detail, they often kill the frog because they're very focused on specific details. And we aren't very good at letting something be. This ties into conceptual
No.
sensitivity, where a lot of people will say, just let it be. Like, there's nuance here, there's complexity, it's fine, we'll let it be. Autistic people aren't good at that. It's, nope, I
No.
need to resolve this, and I am going to hyperfixate on it, and I'm going to analyze it until I resolve it. Most people I've found are not like that. The last part is we are very systematic and very structured, and we need to understand the foundations of something and how everything connects to everything else and all the details about it. I often describe autistic people as people like pocket watch builders when it comes to systems of ideas, in that we will build these very sophisticated, intricate, sensitive machines to work our way through theology and stuff like that. And
Oh,
autistic people really care when things don't add up, where a lot of
yeah.
people mostly don't. And like the small inconsistencies really bother us. Like, really bother us. Everything I'm mentioning here is like
Mm.
significant cognitive dissonance. Questions that are unanswered lead us to hyperfixation. So basically, if we ask a question and we can't get an answer, we will usually tear down heaven and earth just to find the answer to it. And we will not stop. And like, I'm saying this 9 or 10 years into a research project for me trying to figure out why autistic people are less likely to be Christian after thousands of hours put into this question, because I didn't find the answers that I got in a bunch of research papers particularly satisfying. And I'm not an anomaly. This is the typical thing that we do.
Yes. Yeah.
Another thing, Christians often in doctrine use appeals to authority. So they'll be like, this smart person has figured it out, and this is what they think. And autistic people don't care. In general, they're like, show me the work. And I don't care that they've said it. I want to see them figure it out. And if I don't agree with them, I'm totally fine with not agreeing with them. But like, I I had a discussion with a pastor, and when I was going through my deconversion, he's like, "Well, William Lane Craig and Mike Lacona say this about the resurrection," and I was like, "Ask me if I care what they think. This is, I don't care. Like these, I care about the actual work that they've done, not the fact that they're scholars." And they're like, "Yeah, but they have their PhDs," and I'm like, I know people with PhDs and I'm not impressed by them. You should just be able to demonstrate it to me. You shouldn't need to appeal to an authority. And I find
Yeah.
a lot of autistic people are the same. Yeah, again, with all these considered, cognitive dissonance is especially uncomfortable. And in Stuart Rapley's book, he himself actually talks a little bit about his journey, the one about autistic thinking and life of the church. And he describes what he was, an example of what this is like for autistic people.
But surely we all struggle with how literally to take the Bible. I know I do. For many years, such a reply was typical of the responses that I received from friends when seeking to explain questions that troubled me. I found it puzzling that I seemed to find that the common, rather relational ways of thinking and speaking about God and faith did not seem to work for me. It was also odd that although my friends claimed to have many of the same questions, they seemed able to continue functioning, while I found that my efforts to systematize my understanding of my faith and the Bible resulted in the challenges becoming increasingly distressing and debilitating. Over a period of approximately 30 years, questions about God, faith, and the Bible had grown in my mind to the point of causing me real distress. I had always been uncomfortable with the social aspects of church, though I was uncomfortable in most social settings. I simply got on with managing things as best as I could. Over time, many other aspects of church life became problematic, making it difficult even to attend services. As a working man with a busy job and a young family, it was difficult to spend my Sundays, my day of rest, in a context that increased my level of stress and discomfort. As a result, I gradually withdrew from any active engagement with church.
And so he's talking about like how he's really struggling with someone who's like with how literally he's supposed to take the Bible, and no one's given him the answer for like this is the percentage of literal that you need to take the Bible, or this part
Yes.
is metaphorical and this part isn't. And him not having those answers, it causes real genuine distress, and not having the answer and not knowing where to get the answer. And when we talk about this hammer nail effect, like I said before, where this is the primary mode of engagement with Christianity, autistic people, this is the thing that they like about Christianity often,
Yeah.
is the intellectual engagement.
Yeah.
And the other parts of church are often really hard
Yeah.
for us and aren't satisfying and are actually pretty dissonant. And so when the intellectual part now starts causing you problems, it's what else is holding you there?
Yeah.
Nothing is really the answer. And yeah, so let's go into more of why this is a problem. And it basically comes down to all these like different cognitive biases that autistic people have. They make us often very intellectually engaged, and like I said, we build these intricate watch mechanisms, and we like spend all this time figuring out how every theological idea is connected to every other theological idea, and how everything needs to work together in these like very detailed, like perfectly tuned watches. So if you like actually talk to autistic people, like by far the least likely. So if you ask an autistic person to define the Trinity
Mm.
versus a non-autistic person, and I've tested this,
Yeah.
autistic people are significantly less likely to commit a heresy because
Mm.
they actually know what the doctrine is because they've spent a lot of time reading it.
Yeah.
Whereas the average churchgoer is most likely to commit a Sabellianist heresy.
Oh.
They're most likely to endorse a Sabellianist position on the Trinity, which is, or it's also called modalism, which
Yes.
is God appears in different forms and in different modes. So we'll say the Trinity is like water in that it can be
Oh,
in
yeah.
liquid form or solid form or gas form. Yeah, that's actually heresy.
Yes.
Fun fact. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing. It's a common misunderstanding and misinterpretation. But one of the things you'll realize if you talk to autistic Christians is that they usually will not fall into those common understandings because most of their time is spent reading, discussing things, listening to podcasts or lectures, or consuming books about Christianity. And they consume huge amounts of content about understanding their faith to a degree that's like almost comical with the amount of time that they spend doing it.
Yeah.
And it's just what autistic people do. And we build these very intricate systems where lots of things are connected and you need everything in the right place to make it work because we like doing that. Like we like
Yes,
to figure
we
things
do.
out. And it's
Yeah.
just how like sand crabs naturally build their home. So like autistic people do that with autistic people raised in Christianity will often do that with their theology. And like Adam is connected to the flood, is connected to Jesus, is connected to original sin, and the doctrine of the Bible is tied to Jesus, the church, salvation, and we build these really intricate like pocket watches where every gear is like a certain idea and it needs to
Yeah.
turn at certain rates and stuff like that. And then like a single grain of sand falls into the watch mechanism
Oh, yeah.
and
And you
everything
feel like
stops
it's
and nothing,
falling apart.
yeah, and nothing works until you get that piece of sand out. And so, a really good example of this that I found was when I was interviewing a young man. He was 19 and he was coming from a conservative evangelical tradition. And he was really struggling with Christianity. And he came to me and he told me, I've actually figured it out. I can prove that the exact words of the Bible are the ones that should be there. And I went,
Oh,
oh,
oh
okay,
no.
tell me about it and tell me why this is important to you. And here's the quote from him. The quote is, knowing that we have the exact and accurate words from the text is crucial. If something isn't accurate, that creates a continuity problem. Having more manuscripts and copies and having them closer to the time of the original was written increases the likelihood of things being accurate due to the quantity and having less opportunities for error over time. If there are errors, things break apart and totally collapse. So, that is what he said when he was talking to me. And
Yeah.
that is a great example of this watch building that I'm talking about, where it's look, every word written in the New Testament needs to have been the exact word, and the Old Testament. So this person was, he had just finished, he had taken a year off. So he graduated, he took a year off to work, and then he was going to university. He finally decided he was going to study theology and New Testament. I said, okay, how about we talk again in 6 months? And we did. And the guy was just like the largest train wreck of cognitive dissonance that I
Oh.
have ever seen. Because
Yeah, and that's really
he,
heartbreaking because as soon as you said he believed he had it all figured out, that's why I reacted the way I did because I thought, oh no, this is just, it's one of those ways, unfortunately, that churches, a church probably, his church community probably saw that and went, wow, how amazing, he's so strengthened his faith. But
yes,
actually, it's unfortunately a way to ill prepare for
yes,
truly understanding like the history of scripture and why it's important. And so when something contradictory comes along, yeah, inevitably things would fall apart. Oh, my heart breaks.
yeah. So he had taken a few courses on New Testament and Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and he realized when I talked to him, he said, I was lied to. He
Oh
used those exact words, and he had this like deep feeling of betrayal because he was told by the people in his church and by the apologists that he was listening to up to that point that you could prove this. And then he went to take his Dead Sea Scrolls course, and it turns out the Dead Sea Scrolls don't actually prove the 100% accurate transmission of the Bible. And Dead Sea Scrolls scholars will say there is complexity and nuance
yeah.
here, and that we can't actually know everything about the exact transmission. But yeah, this is a really good example of the type of thing that I see happening all the time and the type of thing that I frequently see leading to deconversion. And so we build, like the autistic people, we build these intricate, like interconnected theologies where everything needs to work together. And then basically what we do is we develop apologetics to
Yeah.
protect the watch and find ways of trying to defend our view and the way we do. And like I said, autistic people love apologetics. It's one of the most consistent through lines in the practice of autistic Christian faith is that they will either have gone through or still be in a very apologetics heavy phase of their life. Apologetics, I don't think, is bad. I don't think it's just like a blanket bad thing. I think there are lots of good types of apologetics, and I
Yeah.
think there are types of bad apologetics. It's like everything. I don't think it's a bad thing to intellectually defend the Christian faith. I think it's a good thing. I just think there are really bad ways of doing it. And a lot of autistic people, like, there are all sorts of apologetic endeavors. There are ones that are like, here is how we can prove all these different pieces of doctrine. And then there's ones that are like, here's why I think this position is defensible. And there's a lot of triumphalist apologetics where they're like, we can prove Christianity. And if you disagree, it's because you're an idiot or you don't
Mm.
understand the information or that
Yeah.
you just haven't read as much as me. And if you did, you would agree with me. I'm particularly annoyed by that type of thing. But like autistic people love apologetics because it's one of the primary methods that we can use to resolve cognitive dissonance. So like when we come up with a question, we can go to apologetics to find answers and find techniques for trying to resolve cognitive dissonance, because one of our conflicting ideas will be one way, and then how do I resolve this? You go to the apologists, they give you the answers, you go, this is awesome. This is resolved, this is no longer a problem for me. It's a way of positively engaging with the faith, right? Like you said, a lot of church communities, when you take apologetics really seriously, they will applaud you for it, and they'll talk about, they'll encourage you. This is great. You're taking your faith really seriously, and you're
Yeah.
like really leaning into this. And a lot of times, it's one of the few places where autistic hyperfixation is encouraged and appropriate. And a lot of times, especially when you have a kind of negative experience with a lot of the other aspects of church, it feels really good for the community to be including you and to be encouraging you
Yeah.
instead of you being classified as difficult or confused. And also, we just love learning new things and like solving puzzles and doing all those types of things. And apologetics is a great avenue to do that.
Yeah.
But I think apologetics in general, like how it's done in most Western speaking contexts, for autistic people specifically, leads to the formation of a lot of really bad and unhelpful ways of thinking that
Yeah.
set us up for a lot of cognitive dissonance later down the road. And I think so. I did an interview with Stephen Bedard, who's a autistic pastor, and we talked a lot about apologetics and the role of apologetics in his life. And anyway, here's what he had to say about it. I think it's really good and a really typical example of what I often see.
Sure. And now, when I mentioned evidence that demands a verdict, I would say that was probably the one of the first actual apologetics books that I read, and I loved it. I really loved it. I had no idea that there was this stuff out here, and there was some what I thought were some very compelling arguments, but mixed in there, being put on the same level, were some arguments, even at that early stage, that I thought, I don't know what to do with this. And so for me, the struggle was the argument from fulfilled prophecy, because they would say we can count this up. There's this many prophecies, and in the Old Testament, and look, this is how Jesus fulfilled it, and that is just mathematical proof that this is all true. And my thought was, having at that point, I was making sure I was reading the Bible right through every year. So I had pretty good understanding, even as a layperson. If someone actually read those Old Testament prophecies, it's not always clear that they were directed right towards Jesus. Even the virgin shall give birth. When you actually read it in Isaiah, in the context, that prophecy is being fulfilled in that time. It's saying that this enemy army is going to be, God's going to take care of this in the time that a young woman right now, if she gave birth now, by the time that child is eating solid food, that's when this enemy army is going to be taken care of. That's the immediate content. Now, I am not saying that Matthew was wrong to include that. That was a later stage for me to understand how Matthew sees fulfillment. But in terms of an apologetic argument, you can only use that if you're also praying that the person doesn't look up the Old Testament passages to check on it, because it's going to it's going to be a problem. But as you said, I craved certainty. I needed a complete, foolproof answer. And I was looking for it in numerous ways. Spiritual experiences was one. So all of this was happening right around the time of the Toronto Blessing as well. I don't know if you're familiar with the Toronto Blessing. It was this sort of originated vineyard revival that was happening in Toronto. So I was looking for something amazing to happen there that would be complete proof, an experience that would be proof of God. But I was also looking at it in apologetics. And like you said, it was great at the beginning. I liked it. It was helpful. In fact, it probably helped me when my faith was the weakest, that they're saying this is the truth. So I'm just going to hold on for a little bit longer. But I did find that in some ways, Christian apologetics tries for too high of a level of certainty. So it's not just that the readers are reading it that way, but apologists are trying to prove absolute every little thing and will ignore any evidence to the contrary because it is so important for us to have. If you think it of like a big platter of desserts, you can't even have one crumb from one of those cupcakes fall to the ground. You have to hold the whole thing together or else it's going to fall apart. And that's what I found apologetics attempting to do. And I would say I experienced a deconstruction in many ways. I know that's an overused term, but I didn't have the vocabulary until this kind of thing came up. And really, for me, what happened is almost all of those cupcakes fell off for me. And I was left with this one in the middle, which was the resurrection of Jesus. And there was something that I thought, wow, this still is looking pretty strong here. There are some really good reasons to accept this. And I rebuilt from there, going around the resurrection of Jesus and really being open to just about anything else, not looking the same as it did before. And so I've tried to keep my apologetics around Jesus, especially the resurrection, but a lot of it has ended up being about the existence of Jesus, because that's something that has come up again. And so I do a little bit of that, but I am not interested in apologetics about Noah's Ark or um, even like archaeology of the Old Testament or anything like that, age of the earth, all of that stuff I have no time for. I'd rather just stick with the resurrection. And I think that's where I've landed, even for my own personal faith, but also in how I do apologetics.
So yeah, that clip of Stephen, I played it because it's so typical of the autistic experience with doctrine in the church. Now, Stephen was lucky enough to be one of the few that didn't fully deconvert, but I can't say that's the case for most ex-Christian autistics. Most ex-Christian autistics get to the point where they start to question everything and start to realize that things weren't necessarily the way that they thought they should be, and that leads to a rapid, unscheduled deconversion. That's what happened with me. After I learned that evolution was probably true, I didn't immediately become a ex-Christian. What I did is I started to realize I probably don't know as much about the Bible as I think I do. So I'm just going to go research it and I'm going to go figure this stuff out for myself. And I basically started to go through New Testament studies and Old Testament studies, and that's pretty much all I did. I just consumed information about it. And the more information I consumed, the more questions I had. And I
Yeah.
asked people about it, and I just got terrible answers, and I wasn't satisfied with things because I was like, actually, these things are very complicated and nuanced. And you have told me that you've told me the Bible is inerrant. It is without error. What about this? This seems to be an error for me. And there are various responses to it, some satisfying, some not. But at the end, I think I just need to call a spade, and this is like an error. This is a problem. And I found a lot of other autistic people have the same experience, that basically what a lot of the way doctrine is transmitted to us and the way apologetics reinforces it, we get this perfect storm of bad habits. So the first one is like an all or nothing approach to Christianity, which is basically like you need to accept every single point of doctrine that our church believes. And if you don't accept every single point of doctrine, you're a heretic. Like you're just out of the church. So if you don't believe in, there's no sense of triage, there's no sense of doctrines having different weight and importance. It's like everything is important, and if you throw away any part of it, you might as well throw the whole thing away. And if an autistic person really just can't bring themselves, because of the intense cognitive dissonance they feel, they can't bring themselves to accept a specific point of doctrine. They go, I guess I'm not a Christian anymore. If you say I need to accept this and I don't, I guess I can't accept it. You often get, as well, I found, a wild overstatement of evidence. A lot of times, apologetics gives the appearance of certainty or the performance of certainty and the assurance that we can prove certain things in the Bible. A classic one is we can prove Noah's Ark happened, or we can prove that the New Testament was written by eyewitnesses, or that detail X in whatever book of the Bible is true. And when you look at the actual evidence for it and you look at the actual scholarship and the actual reasoning, we can say it's likely that this is true, but we can't actually say this is true. However, autistic people have, at this point, being fairly black and white thinkers, have been conditioned to think that, like, in this black and white way, and if it's
Yeah.
like 1% false, it's completely false and there's no point in believing it. And
Yeah.
it's either true or it's either false, the light switch. And with this overstatement of evidence, when you actually, like Stephen said in the clip, it's like they tell you these things hoping you just don't look it up for yourself. It's with a lot of things. And I found this, and I personally, going through my deconversion, I was like pissed. I was so angry when I was going through this because I was like, there is so much complexity and nuance and all of these things. And we could have been talking about it. We could have been discussing it. We could have been
Yeah.
having substantive conversations about this. And we're not. You just told me this is true, and I believed you, and you lied to me. And
Yeah.
maybe as an autistic person, I misinterpreted what they were saying, or I took things literally. Happy to grant that I probably did that. Happy to grant that I might have been part of the problem. But at the same time, if instead things were communicated with nuance, I probably wouldn't feel a very strong sense of betrayal because I
Yeah.
did. And a lot of autistic Christians who go through deconversion feel this intense sense of betrayal because there are lots of problems. There's also like just one sided examination of available data. And so they'll be like looking at the New Testament manuscript tradition. Apologists will go through and they will say, we know this has been perfectly preserved, or we know that like all the core doctrines are unaffected by textual variants in the New Testament. And it's true. However, that is a fairly one sided examination of the data. And there are lots
Yeah.
of people who disagree with that statement. And there are lots of nuances that they intentionally left out of there. And I know they intentionally leave it out of there because they're New Testament scholars. They know these things exist. But when you're presenting these things to a popular audience, there's a lot of complexity and nuance.
Yeah. I think it's actually really, it does a disservice not only to the people, listening to these apologetics, but to the craft of apologetics itself. It's not meant to be the be all and end all of helping people understand the Christian faith. It's meant to be a jumping off point. It's meant to point people to a deeper look into the faith. And it's limited in scope to do in a complete way. It's not a theology course at a tertiary education institution. It's taking information that comes from these institutions and bringing it into a way that makes it easy for lay people to understand. But there's only so much you can do with that. And so if I've seen this so many times, not just with the Protestant apologetics, but also as I went into Catholicism. Of course, yeah, apologetics was stuff that I looked into, but there was also deeper theological texts that I had to read up on because I was making a huge decision to switch teams here. And you don't want to take that kind of decision lightly. And there is a dissatisfaction with the way that the Catholic apologetics work because they present this overly simplistic And yeah, very one-sided way of being Catholic, especially the most popular ones that come out of the States. They will often take what is the most rigid interpretation of church doctrine and magisterial documents and the like, because it feels more like they're serving a certain agenda, which is not just trying to make the case that Catholicism is true, but also that a certain interpretation and way of Catholicism is the true Catholicism. And it has caused not only like crises of faith for individual autistic people, often who had relied upon a lot of these resources in joining the church in adulthood, but those who had used it to bolster their own faith when they were raised in it, and they were coming to terms with some of the more scandalous things that happened within the Catholic Church, and also people who take theology seriously. And it's also having social implications in the life of the church itself, to the point that it's bolstering a lot of the issues that exist within the American Catholic Church. So it's interesting hearing a lot of this from both your assessment of it and in Stephen's clip, of how apologetics industries too often try to be the be all and end all of educating in an intellectual level for Christianity, but it can't be that. It can only be a starting off point for deeper exploration, and it's very dishonest to not point people to where that deeper exploration is.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And one thing I found with ex-Christian autistics who left the Catholic Church is they will specifically say like they were really into like Pints with Aquinas or Trent Horn, I think it
Yeah.
is. And they're like, yeah, and I was like, of course, Catholicism and this specific interpretation of Catholicism is the right one. And then they start getting into church history, and then they start realizing, huh, there's a little bit more uncertainty here than I was initially led to believe.
Yes.
They're like, oh, there are a lot of differing interpretations of these councils, and the history behind, or going through Catholic Answers and reading through
Mm.
their defense of the Crusades as being
Oh,
actually a totally cool and good thing. And then
yeah.
they read about the Crusades and they're like, wow, this was a crime against humanity. Um,
Yes.
and the thing is, they wouldn't be going through this crisis of faith if people were just honest with them and like they had
Yeah.
good mentoring. If someone took them aside and went, look, we have a lot of nuance and complexity here, and let's walk through the nuance and complexity. Let's set realistic expectations of what the data can tell us, and let's talk openly and honestly about where the data cannot get us and what we should do instead.
Yeah.
I know this works because I do this all the time. Like I have this conversation all the time, and it works really well. But
Yeah.
I usually am having this conversation after a person has, they're usually very angry because they're like, I was lied to and I feel betrayed. And they're usually like really upset. And it would be great if they just didn't have to go through that. Let's just not do that, right? Because you get this, like, within autistic people, you get this perfect storm of like literalistic interpretation, very rigid, structured, systematic theologies that include everything, and very high levels of confidence and certainty, and a requirement for high confidence and high certainty. So like they're not going to accept a, there's a 60% chance that this is probably the correct interpretation of history, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
when you look at, so I went through a period where I was looking into Catholicism and Orthodoxy, and the reason I didn't eventually go through with them is because mostly I looked at the history and I was like, I understand the Catholic arguments for why they hold to these positions. However,
Mm.
I don't know if, I think you can be reasonable in accepting them, but I don't know if I am comfortable with the amount of trust that I need to put in a human institution to justify this, right? And then I had the Anglican Church, and it was like, I can get all the things I really like within Catholicism there, so I'm gonna go with the Anglicans. But a lot of that, like complexity and nuance and uncertainty, is just a fact of life that we have to deal with, but we aren't primed to deal with it. And we're primed
No.
to think, actually, we can prove that this interpretation is the right interpretation and that all other interpretations are garbage or they're wrong. If you get really into the Protestant Catholic debates, they're super annoying and I don't think
Oh
they're
my
very productive.
gosh.
Yeah, but both
Yeah, I found
sides
that
are
actually.
extremely triumphalist, right? Every side
Yeah,
is, you are an idiot if
yeah.
you don't understand the teachings of the Catholic Church. And then the other side is, you have to be like unable to read the data or unhonest with it to hold the position that the Catholics hold. And it's just, this is
I
stupid.
think I think I was glad. I was glad that, yeah, even though I did engage with a lot of the Catholic apologetics side of things as I was getting into my conversion, yes, that did include, regrettably, Trent Horn. But the ones that I found that really convinced me weren't these triumphalist ones that were trying to prove the other wrong, but merely stating, look, this is what we actually teach and this is what we actually believe as a church, especially with clearing up misconceptions. There's a difference between clearing up a misconception that the other side
Yep.
holds about you and trying to dunk on the other side in doing so. And I really appreciated where they cleared up misconceptions, because that was something I wanted to look into when I was considering where I was going to go with my faith community. I was a bit closed-minded about Catholicism and Orthodoxy because of just biases. I live in a country that is by default slightly more Protestant than Catholic, although not very practicing. So of course I was like wanting to make sure that if I was going to examine it, I was going to examine it as exposed to what it actually said as much as possible. And so then when I was, convinced, it was due to the fact that they weren't trying to prove anything. They were just saying, this is what we believe, and we understand that you're not necessarily going to assent to that, but if you're not going to assent to what we believe, at least assent to what we actually teach rather than what you may have heard about us. And so that when I had friends and some relatives around me who were not okay with the fact that I was joining the Catholic Church, and then they tried to be like, but have you read this thing that proves how the Catholic Church is wrong? And it's, yes, I have. And they suck because they don't they completely, these are all the things that I've already shown that is actually being proven incorrect. And sometimes there was an assumption I was being triumphalist by trying to show that this was a misconception, but no, I'm not trying to convince you to join the church. I'm just trying to say, at least be intellectually honest about it, at least know
Yeah.
what it is that it's teaching before you dismiss it outright as an option for me. And I would say, I think, as a personal example, the only apologist from that side of things that I have any time for, because he does not engage in this triumphalism. He's not engaged in any weird culture war rhetoric, which is the direction that they've been going down in the States, and is not for some reason becoming a Tridentine Mass fanboy, which there's nothing wrong with the Tridentine Mass. It's just, there's, again, defending it shouldn't come at a triumphalist attitude. But the one person I do still hold in somewhat of a high esteem is Jimmy Aiken, because he's not triumphalist in his apologetics. He very much is about, look, let's clear up some misconceptions. He's very ecumenical in the dialogues that he does when he engages with people outside of the church. I do not agree with a lot of his takes, especially outside of specifically engaging in apologetics and theology, but I do respect him in the apologetics and theology side to that. And he just presents it, look, this is what it is. Here are a few other interpretations. I personally don't hold to that interpretation because of X, Y, and Z reason. So he even engages with interpretations that don't necessarily line up with what he is necessarily in favor of. And he's intellectually honest enough to disclose that, hey, some of this is my opinion as well, and you're free to engage with your interpretation. Yeah, and it's no surprise that a lot of people who've been balked off of a lot of that Catholic apologetics world still hold some respect for Jimmy Akin for that reason, and others like him who engage in similar manner.
Yeah, no, absolutely, 100%. And I just want to reinforce some things you were saying there. I don't think apologetics is bad. I still really like apologetics. I just think that apologetics should be more transparent, honest, and realistic. I think there are lots of misconceptions about Christianity, lots of misunderstandings of various doctrines just in general. And I don't think there's any like problem with Christians saying, let's try to set the record straight. Let's try to accurately represent us. And there's all sorts of apologetic approaches that I think are good and respectable. Like you said, Jimmy Akin, I'm not a Catholic, but I'm like, yeah, I think he's a fairly decent guy. And while I don't agree with him on things, I think he is willing to engage with a lot of this stuff in a realistic manner. And I think that's perfectly fine and a perfectly respectable thing to do. But unfortunately, that's not the majority of apologetics out there. And what you get is this massive storm of bad habits reintroduced with the reality that life is complicated and doctrine is complicated and you often can't fit things into nice neat containers, and that sometimes things spill over and sometimes things don't fit very nicely, and that's perfectly fine, but don't often get that message. And so the autistic people go through and they encounter these things, and because they have this high expectation of certainty, it causes cognitive dissonance when they can no longer reach that same level that they're used to. And it's concerning to them, and it's genuinely difficult for them to reevaluate these expectations that they have been taught are the reasonable ones to have. So they've been told, we can prove these things to this standard, and this is the standard you should expect things to be at. And when things are no longer at that standard, they go, oh, this is actually bad, or this is wrong, and they leave it. And a lot of churches and a lot of Christians really don't help out because they adopt this kind of my way or the highway approach to doctrine.
Oh,
Where I think there's such a wide variety of interpretations of doctrines within each specific denomination. Like you were talking about with Catholicism, there are a lot of different ways to interpret the church's magisterial teaching on
oh
a
yeah,
variety of different issues, right?
oh yeah,
But a lot
yes,
of times
absolutely.
churches and apologists will say, no, this is the right way to think about that. And if you're not thinking about that, you're wrong about this. And you are in conflict with the true teachings of the church. And the autistic person goes, I think that's true. And this is the position that I hold. And because there's this kind of my way or the highway attitude, the autistic person is like, all right, highway it is. See you later.
Yeah, exactly.
I like when you're told you need to accept this interpretation instead of saying, look, here is a generous set of boundaries of what positions are generally acceptable. And so long as you're within that range, it's fine mostly. I disagree with you, but it's fine that we disagree. Reasonable people can disagree on these things, but often that's not what you get. Often what you
Right.
get is here's the right way, and if you don't accept it, you're wrong and should leave. Or not you're wrong and you should leave. You're wrong and you should repent and start thinking about it in the way that I do. And yeah, because of how autistic people are typically that light switch instead of the dial, it's oh, okay, I don't think that way. Boop, off. And I'm gone. And I see this time and time again. If you ask autistic people to talk about their deconstruction stories, it's the same thing, the same pattern, and it's all of these things all working together. They might not all work together at the same timeline. it might not be as clear, but like you see a lot of these points getting hit over and over.
Yeah.
And so, just to name the things that cause issues for autistic people, like the three main doctrinal issues that cause a lot of cognitive dissonance are first, like the claims of religion and science. So, creationism, the flood in the Bible, that type of thing is often a serious point of cognitive dissonance for autistic people that they can often solve some ways, but often the ways that they figure out that are satisfying for them to solve aren't accepted by the other Christians around them. And they're like, no, we actually don't think it's that way, and you're wrong about this. And
Yeah.
Christians don't think about these problems that way. The next really big one, which is almost as big and it's usually combined, is the historicity and accuracy of the Bible. Going through and asking, is what the Bible teaches true? And often there is this, especially in Protestant circles, this idea of biblical inerrancy. The Bible is
Yes.
without error.
Yeah.
And a lot of autistic people have a hard time accepting that because what an autistic person sees as an error, or what a lot of times people will say biblical inerrancy. But if you read the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy, that's like the main nuance for it. They'll say things like approximations of numbers and stuff like that aren't what we're talking about. But for autistic
Yeah.
people, numbers are really matter. Or an example I see a lot are like the competing genealogies of Jesus that you see in Matthew and in Luke. So
Oh,
if you go
yeah.
through the genealogies, they're both the genealogies of Jesus through Joseph, and they don't align. So you can just go through and read them, and it's this guy beget that guy, and then they don't connect. And the autistic person goes, that doesn't seem right. And then there are a whole bunch of apologetics to explain why this isn't actually an error. But there is a sort of presuppositional element there, right? Because
Yeah.
there are really three options that you can have, or four options. Both genealogies are correct, Luke is correct, Matthew is correct, or none of them are correct. And there's no way to determine which one of those you should choose. And oftentimes, people will say, we know both of them are correct because the Bible is inerrant. And the autistic person will go, and I know this because I've heard it like 1,000 times, but is this not a counterexample to show that the Bible isn't inerrant? Because it
Yeah.
seems like this is an error. And then you'll get this chicken and egg scenario, whereas, is this inerrant? Yes, it's inerrant. And it's inerrant because we know it's inerrant. Or like, it's, or they'll be like, why is it not valid to say that one is wrong or neither are wrong? And it's that would be saying the Bible has errors in it. And you see this type of reasoning. It's not just the historicity and accuracy of the Bible, it's also just like the church's teaching, just in general. And autistic people get really stuck on these. And so a lot of times, practicing autistic Christians, a lot of them will take the Bible very seriously, will take the biblical inspiration very seriously, but won't be able to endorse a view of biblical inerrancy because it
Mm.
causes them so much cognitive dissonance. And they're like,
Yes.
I can't assent to this
Yeah.
because there are so many things that are uncertain. There are so many places I can point to in the Bible where I say, I genuinely don't know if this is an error or if the explanations provided by apologists are correct. Because, like, whenever you try to harmonize two texts that appear to say different things, it is valid to say one of those texts is wrong. And there's no way of knowing. There's literally no way of figuring it out. And it's very frustrating for us. And so a lot of autistics simply will not, like, they will hold to a high view of scripture, they will hold all those things, but they will not say the Bible is inerrant. Like
Yeah.
I've talked to some Baptist ministers who are in fairly conservative churches, and they're like, I hold to biblical inerrancy, and their definition of biblical inerrancy is so complicated and so nuanced that it's like it's I believe in biblical inerrancy. Now let me list my 90 pages of caveats to that statement for a lot of autistic Baptist ministers. And then And yeah, and then the final issue is like moral claims about the Bible or about the church, specifically relating to things like genocide in the Old Testament or genocide in the church. So a lot of Catholic autistics will be like, I actually learned what happened in the Crusades, or I learned about the Albigensian Crusades, and hold on a second. Or and the other two really big moral claims that cause autistic people to feel cognitive dissonance is the treatment of women and the treatment of queer people. Mostly for women, the problem is usually, are women less valuable or less useful or somehow different in a way that makes them unsuitable for leadership? And in their personal lives, they'll be like, no, that isn't true. I work with women. A woman's my boss. One of the
Mm-hmm.
guys I interviewed, he started going through a crisis of faith because he was living in a church that was very complementarian. And then he had a female boss, and he was like, wait a second, everything I've been told about the nature of women is false. this my boss is perfectly capable of doing all these things. Wait a
Yeah.
second. And they're like, what? Wait, what if we're wrong about other things as well? And the same thing with LGBTQ plus people, or like just the queer community in general. It's a lot of times it's like these people are, they just want to live in sin, they're morally degenerate, they deny the existence of God, they know God in their heart, but they refuse to read Romans 1. And then the autistic person will meet gay people and be like, oh, these are actually just normal, regular people who are not actually these agents of Satan trying to destroy the world. And that makes them go, wait a second, why does Christianity hate these people? And and that will lead to triggering their deconversion. Yeah, we've talked about these types of things, but I'll just go through a quick case study of what the typical autistic deconversion from Doctrine looks like. And like this is so I'm going to go with one of the most common scenarios I encounter, which is biblical inerrancy, where people really struggle with this. So what happens is the autistic person goes through the Bible and encounters something that he's like, I don't know if this is an error or if this is, there is a lot of uncertainty about whether or not this is true. Like I gave like the example of genealogies in Matthew and Luke. And so the first thing they'll do is they'll say, I need to figure out a way to resolve this. The first place they usually go is like appeals to authority. So priests, parents, mentors, pastors, youth group leaders, whatever, and they will usually find really unsatisfying answers that don't actually answer their problem. So they'll go into self guided research. And in their self guided research, they'll read books, listen to podcasts, go to YouTube debates and lectures. And in this time, they will start to find more problems than answers. And during this time, they'll
Yeah.
start to uncover other issues and other things that start causing them cognitive dissonance. And so it started with one tiny thing. And because it wasn't answered satisfactorily, it's now 10 things. And those 10 things now lead to 100 things. And those 100 things lead to 1,000. And it like the amount of cognitive dissonance starts to exponentially grow as they start to nuance their opinions. And
Yeah.
there's usually a really sincere attempt for them to save their faith. And the only way they know how is to research it, right? It's to do this intellectualizing that they've been doing the whole time and that
Yes.
they've been
Yeah.
assured is going to be the pathway out because they've been told we can prove this. And like all the things we believe are reasonable and within the realm of proof. And so they sincerely are like, okay, good. Let me investigate it. Let me do that proving that you tell me I can do. And then they go through and it just builds and they don't find the answers convincing. And then they start having even harder questions for their mentors, for their priests, for their pastors. And they're often really, like we talked about in evangelism, they are not equipped to communicate with autistic people. And like when I went to the pastors, Like, I went to pastors when I already had this thoroughly researched, and I was talking about things that they didn't know existed. I remember talking to a pastor and talking about how in the book of John, the story of the woman caught in adultery isn't in our earliest manuscripts, and how that was an issue for me. And the pastor didn't know that. And he was like, that's not true. And we literally Googled it and we showed it in a reference Bible where it had that like footnote. And he goes,
Oh,
huh,
yeah.
I never knew that. And it's like,
Wow.
oh man.
Yeah.
Or like the various endings of Mark that exist. Like that's another one. And he goes, wow. And
Oh,
I just remember
no.
thinking, I'm like, oh, we're screwed.
Yeah.
And autistic people are often very in the weeds in this in a way that a lot of non-autistic people aren't. And there are questions of deep specificity that you like need a master's in specific New Testament study to be able to answer. It's just how it goes. And
Yeah.
then when they don't get answers, there's often a very like negative reaction to them poking around where they shouldn't or asking questions.
Yeah.
And when they start to voice their feelings, they're often pretty harshly criticized. Their concerns are dismissed. They're called doubters, and doubt is seen as a moral failing. And oftentimes, when questioning is encouraged, what I said before, questioning is encouraged only so far as you ask the right questions and accept the right answers. So it's like questions are encouraged, but not if you're questioning inerrancy and you don't find the answers I give you satisfying. In that case, it's a problem. And usually,
Yeah.
the you're encouraged to ask questions isn't a genuine good faith thing. It's used as a defense mechanism to doctrinally protect you.
Yeah.
And usually the negative reactions that the autistic person gets leads them to double down. They view everyone else as being like emotional and they're not grounded in logic and reason. And you told me I could go through this process and figure this out. I'm going through it and I'm not figuring it out. What is going on? Why aren't you answering my questions? And eventually, they'll have so much cognitive dissonance that's unresolved that they are going to need a way to deal with it because it's genuinely uncomfortable. It genuinely hurts.
Yeah.
And for autistic people, because we're often because of our cognitive biases, we really see two options. We can stay in the faith and live this really uncomfortable dissonance. And often, like I said before, there isn't a whole lot else in the church that keeps us happy. This
Mm.
was the thing we liked, and there are so many other negative experiences in the church. And it's
Yeah.
just like a cognitive dissonance nightmare for everything else. Doctrine was the one thing keeping the rest of the cognitive dissonance at bay, and now the dam has broken
Yeah.
and everything else is there. And so it's do I stay in this place that is continuously making me miserable and hyper fixating on all these details and sitting with questions that I can't answer? Or should I just leave? And that first option pretty much isn't an option for most people. And so they're just like, I can't carry this burden anymore. I'm just
Yeah.
going to drop it and walk away. And they often at this point are convinced that most of the doctrines they were taught are either there's uncertainty with them or they're convinced they're not true. And so they're like, why would I stay with this? And they go.
Yeah.
That's basically what happens. And yeah, there's
Usually the response from a low church space is when that thing happens. Because of the double empathy problem, there's this misunderstanding as to the motives of why the autistic person would very much drill into these questions unsatisfied with the sort of trite answers that are provided, and even seemingly heavy hitting intellectual answers that are provided that actually don't really step up to the plate. And very often you'll hear things like they were just looking for an excuse to leave anyway, because there's this
yeah,
assumption that because of the fact that they keep asking the same questions again and again, not satisfied with the answers they've received, becomes the perception.
yeah, no, absolutely. That's a great addition to that story. And that's I've seen it happen so many times, and it happens almost exactly like
Oh,
this. And there are
yeah.
probably some people listening to this being like, how do you know my story? It's because it's not just your story, man. It's
Yeah.
everyone's. It's like half of us. And yeah, so there's one more or a few more things that I think play heavily into this. And one of them is this concept called doxastic involuntarism. And it's a technical term used in the philosophy of mind. And the idea of doxastic involuntarism is the idea that you can't really choose to believe something, and that
Mm.
your intellectual assent to a proposition is not something that you consciously control or that you're aware of. An example, you can't convince yourself that if you sit at the bottom of a pool for 5 minutes, you won't die. Or you can't convince yourself that you can breathe underwater
Oh,
because,
yeah.
and that's not a conscious decision you make. Like
No.
you can't force yourself to do that. Or touching molten lava with your bare hands, you can't convince yourself that won't sear your hand
Oh,
because you just subconsciously know that lava is hot. When the hot thing touch, hand burn. And that's not a thing that your brain is consciously like making yourself decide. Or an example I often give is if you are not sitting in an airplane, you cannot convince yourself that you are actually sitting in an airplane. And that's mostly because in your brain, you have certain standards of evidence and certain like subconscious expectations of reality and perception of reality that you yourself do not control, but you build these expectations as you live and your experience of the world. And the reason we talked about that autistic experience of the world is because this shapes these like subconscious factors in your head about what you can believe is plausible and what you can't. And because
yeah.
autistic people, like through basically our socialization process, we develop this like skepticism and empiricism, and what you talked about and like how your socialization routines were developed by sitting outside and watching people, and that starts at a very young age and you don't
Yeah.
consciously think about it, but it reinforces something in your head. And this often leads to autistic people having these like ways of understanding the world that lead us to really bias things that are logical, measurable, provable, and like really amenable to the way that we currently interact with the world. And
Yeah.
like this matters for us because we want to figure everything out. And like when we go through a lot of Christian doctrine, especially once we start that critical examination phase and we learn things about, a lot of times when you're a kid it's like you're taught we know this because the Bible says it and it's true because it's in the Bible. And then you grow older and you're like, I actually need to prove that the Bible is true. And like for a lot of autistic people, they get to a certain point and this sort of doxastic involuntarism,
Mm.
like this intuition that they develop from just existing in the world, tells them certain things. Virgins can't get pregnant. Dead people don't come back to life. People don't have cancer spontaneously cured. God doesn't help you find your car keys. This doesn't work. And it's not like a conscious thing they choose to believe. It's just because they have been living like this, there are these subconscious things that form. And especially once they start learning about the complexity and uncertainty and difficulty of a lot of Christian doctrine, this innate skepticism kicks in and they're like, I just can't force myself to believe this anymore. And a lot of people that reconvert talk about like how they were unable to overcome this doxastic involuntarism response, like this involuntary response to rejecting Christian doctrine. And it took them years to untrain themselves in a way that they couldn't control. But yeah, I think that's just another important factor to talk about. And then, yeah, we've already talked about presuppositional things and that. I think this is a good place to end. Yeah, we're not done with doctrine yet, though. There is still more to go on doctrine, just completely different type of doctrine in the next one.
Are we ever done with
Oh,
doctrine?
we never are.
Christianity.
We're never done with it. You're right. my whole point here is that like autistic people are just very fact oriented and very intellectually engaged, and like other aspects of the faith often are very difficult for us to grasp. And because we have this really good hammer, we're like, yes, nail everything. And often the way that doctrine is presented isn't presented in a way that considers the complexities and nuances of the way that autistic people think about things, right? Because if everyone in your congregation was autistic, you would probably stay away from using very strong declarative language.
Yeah.
Because you would make sure, I know this just from talking to a lot of autistic people, like when I talk about Christian claims, I say something and then the next 10 sentences are me making nuances to that first thing that I said because I'm like this caveat and of course caveat, because I know that a healthy way of communicating things to autistic people is one that like respects the way that they think and the way that they process the world and analyze the world. And I don't want them to think that I'm lying to them,
Mm.
because I want them to think that I'm properly trying to engage with them in an honest way. But it takes a while. And most people don't want to sit there and listen to a 10-hour long discourse on why we believe something to be true when you could have just taken one sentence to say it. But autistic people really do. And I find because we don't take that time and because we're not sensitive to these autistic cognitive biases and communication styles, a lot of times we're set up for failure. And the take everything or take nothing approach, the my way or the highway approach, the unwillingness to deal with nuance and complexity, it's a pretty big deal for autistic people. And again, this is only one factor. Don't worry, we're going to talk about the rest of it coming up. But yeah, I think that's a good place to cap it.
Yeah. I think, yeah. Um,
Go ahead.
oh, yeah. I think it's an important step forward. Jumping off from the point you said there, that often it's difficult because neurotypical people aren't going to spend 10 hours focusing on particular doctrinal questions where they'd be satisfied with the sentence, but it's the complete opposite for autistic people. I think a lot of the issue that also happens is that theology tertiary degrees and seminaries are often inaccessible to a majority of the population. You often have to have a lot of economic backing behind you in order to get into the weeds, so to speak. And I think this is one of those areas where churches and ministries have an opportunity to make such things more accessible, where it's less of a simplistic apologetics based way of discussing doctrinal issues through sound bites and cherry picking sources and biases, and actually really laying that out. We often hear about education, especially higher education, being this lofty ivory tower thing. And if the church is to be a as well as a pastoral resource, but also a teaching resource for everyday Christians, I think taking time outside of church services and usual youth group ministries and the like to actually really dig into those weeds that a lot of people are either unsure about or uncomfortable about doing can actually provide a good opportunity for autistic people to have a space to really get into those difficult questions. It's unfortunately an opportunity that often doesn't come around. I know it exists out there. I myself have participated in programs like this, but it's so few and far between. Yeah, while yes, this series is oriented towards the autistic community, I really hope anyone from these church spaces who is wanting to know how do we best mitigate, this is just one of many ways that you can really look at how to approach this better.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the biggest problem, again, isn't necessarily doctrine. I think it's the way doctrine is communicated. And I
Yeah.
just think we do
Yes.
the overarching theme of all these episodes so far is
Yes.
we're communicating with autistic people and they're not picking up what we're laying down, and we're not picking up what they're laying down. And I think this is just another example of that. Yeah, so I'll see you in the next episode.
See you then.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Christianity on the Spectrum. If you're interested in contacting me, you can find me at christianityonthespectrum@gmail.com or Twitter at ChristianityOn. You can find Amy at It Began in the 90s. It's 90 with a 90, also on Twitter. We'll be doing some Q&A episodes after the main podcast is finished. If you have any questions about my research, you can email me or send me a message on Twitter with your questions, and I will get to addressing them during that Q&A. If you want to do a live Q&A, schedule a talk or a presentation about my research for your church, small group, or just as an individual person, you can find me at all the places I've already mentioned. If you'd like to join a Discord of like-minded autistics, please send me a message at one of the above listed places, and I will send you an invitation link. Thank you.